Okay, we're looking at the Ice Age after the proposed worldwide flood. As evidence that the Ice Age constitutes a catastrophe that is utterly inexplicable in terms of present processes, one need only recall again the fact that there are dozens of hypotheses that have been advanced attempting to explain its cause and mechanisms. All have had grave defects, and none has yet been generally accepted. The Biblical Deluge, on the other hand, offers an eminently satisfactory explanation. The combined effect of the uplift of the continents and mountain chains and the removal of the protective canopy around the earth could hardly have failed to induce great snow and ice accumulations in the mountains and on the land near areas near the poles. And these glaciers and ice caps must have continued to accumulate and spread until they reached latitudes and altitudes at which the marginal temperatures caused melting rates in the summers adequate to offset accumulation rates in the winters. The total amount of water locked up in these great glaciers during their greatest extent is not yet known, but it may have been very great. The main evidence of this fact is in the greatly lowered sea levels of the Ice Age. In the past decade, a large amount of evidence has been amassed to show that ocean levels were at least 400 feet lower than present. Russell goes on to say, possibly much more is shown by such features as the continental shelves, seamounts, submerged canyons and terraces, etc. It has been argued that once an ice sheet got started, it would probably grow rapidly and extensively and huge. This would perhaps be possible, Brooks says, in the years immediately following the deluge. An abundant supply of moisture, strong polar winds, lowered polar temperatures due to both to removal of the thermal blanket and possible dense accumulation of volcanic dust particles in the atmosphere, newly uplifted mountains, essentially barren topography of the denuded lands, all these and possibly other factors could have contributed to the rapid accumulation and growth of ice sheets. These factors are all legitimately deduced from the record of the flood and would be quite sufficient to explain the Ice Age. Catastrophic nature thereof, however, will be, of course, unacceptable to many geologists because it's a belief system. What do you believe first? And let's find evidence for it, force it. Go to Walt Disney Studios, make something up. There's a movie called Frozen. Evolutionist Stokes could seem to accept the truth about the catastrophic flood even when the evidence overwhelmingly supports it. He cannot seem to accept the truth. What he says is, although extraordinary, and even catastrophic events may have caused the ice ages and their oscillations, it is nevertheless true that the ideal theory ought to fit within the framework of uniformitarian principles. It ought to fit. Are you a scientist? Ought to fit. Nevertheless, the flood theory, he says, satisfactorily meets the requirements for a glacial mechanism, glacial age mechanism. Oh, at least he says that. The idea must be prepared to explain simultaneous glaciations over the entire Earth. Last but not least, the theory must explain the greatest paradox of all, the evidence of cold and ice existing and increasing simultaneously with conditions that favored accelerated evaporation and precipitation. I can't explain that. Ice Age follows a worldwide flood. In general, the various aspects of glacial and Pleistocene geology as commonly held by geologists are quite in harmony with our deductions from the biblical accounts, except with respect to the time-age element. We don't push age onto it. It happened all at once, less than 6 months. Some of the larger and more indurated, physically hardened formations attributed by the so-called Pleistocene period in the non-glaciated areas are perhaps best grouped with the later so-called tertiary deposits as formed during the last stages of the flood, with the effects of uplift involved. But most of the so-called Pleistocene deposits can be accepted as post-deluge, associated with the continental glaciers or the equivalent events in unglaciated regions, and can be accepted substantially as interpreted by glacial geologists. So the onset of the age and continued is evidence for only one ice age, one glaciation. If we got multiple areas around the planet, ice age evidence, and there's only one, then it must have been a worldwide flood. It may be objected that a flood-induced glaciation does not account for the 4 glacial stages, which are quite generally accepted, the belief system, by geologists is accepted as composing the entire supposed Pleistocene glacial epoch. Glacial geologists believe that each of the 4 supposed stages was separated by a warm period comparable to that of the present, or perhaps even warmer. The glaciations, just as we have envisioned, as brought on by the deluge, would more likely be one event, not 4 separate. In fact, it is uncertain that what could have terminated the Ice Age at all once it got started. As a matter of fact, the reason that is so difficult to account theoretically for the evolutionist hypothesis of the 4 glacial stages may be simply that they never existed. It should not be thought that the evidence for the 3 earlier stages is the same as that for the last. They have to do this, their belief system, they neglect to observe and report. The supposed earlier stages of glacial periods are evidenced, according to evolutionists, mainly by a deposit of gumbo till, supposedly a very mature and weathered clay soil containing small stones. It is explained that these gumbo tills are the weathered remnants of formary till deposits. A till, defined as a till, is an unstratified deposit of gravel, sand, and clay, which is considered evidence of glacial origin. Okay, they make up their own special terms there. Sometimes they're hard to pronounce. The apparent depth of leaching of carbonate in these soils has been used as the chief basis of estimating their age of formation. Note only that the earlier tills, usually devoid of any of the typical glacial formations characterizing the last one, but also the later shows no evidence of gumbo till formation as in the early ones. They're not all identical. In addition to the lack of extensive evidence over large areas, all these factors, which provided limited local support for several glacial periods, but not worldwide, can be explained on the other grounds than large-scale glacial fluctuations in the climate. See, the picture that is beginning to emerge then is of one of great glaciation brought on by the events associated with the Great Flood. The spreading of ice sheets fanned out over areas which recently emerged from the flood waters and probably has yet little vegetation, and so were easily subject to tremendous erosion. Great quantities of newly hardened rock materials were plucked up and carried along by the ice, eventually being deposited in some sort of moraine, which is an accumulation of earth and stones carried and finally deposited by a glacier. Then, probably reworked by marginal streams in many cases. Too many factors involved to coincidentally occur all this at the same time. The glacier undoubtedly waxed and waned a number of times, permitting a great variety of deposits to be formed along its margins, but there's no real justification for inferring long interglacial periods. But they do. Except relatively near the ice ages, the climate was not materially affected, so that floral and fauna populations of considerable variety could exist reasonably near. It was only as the ice sheet finally began its permanent retreat to the kinds of organisms now adapted best to cold climates began to separate from those more fitted for temperate climates. In the temperate, and especially in the subtropical latitude, where most of the biblical and other early peoples enacted their histories, very little influence of the glaciers would have been felt, with the probable exception of higher average precipitation than now occurs and of the relatively lower sea level. The intimation of only one great glaciation has received very recently support from intensive studies made during the International Geophysical Year. A paper to be presented at the December meeting a long time ago, an AAAS in Washington, D.C., will include a proposal for a wholly new concept of Ice Age history. Deposits formerly attributed to 4 or 5 separate Pleistocene glaciations, both in America and Europe, are deposits now considered as a single glaciation. Normal retreat of the borders of the ice cap permitted the Leverett Sea to expand into the valleys of southern New England and the lower Hudson Valley and in the Mississippi Basin over the whole area of the so-called Nebraskan, Kansan, and Illinoisan glaciations, so that an immense ice marginal body of water was formed, extending from Ohio to Montana and from Gulf of Mexico to the Wisconsin driftless area. They're beginning to go back to evolution, but they're not going to admit it. Iceberg rafted erratic stones and boulders became grounded on the submerged topography of northern Kentucky, southwestern Missouri, and eastern Iowa, the so-called Iowan stage. Gumbo clays, until recently interpreted to be weathered tills, were deposited within the expanse of the sea level waters, along with driftwood and other organic material heretofore interpreted to be interglacial deposits. Said it's now deposited as seawater deposition. Immense cames, mounds of stratified drift deposited by glacial meltwater, and eskers, mounds of sand, gravel, or boulders deposited by a stream flowing on, within or beneath a stagnant glacier, were built by subglacial rivers emerging from beneath the ice border underwater. Reduction of the Ice Age to unity shortens geologic history and nullifies the present meaning of the terms Nebraskan, Kansan, Illinoisan, and Wisconsin, and the several interglacials. Ice Age history appears to have been influenced or regulated far less by climatic changes and moraine building than by the intermittent character of the great land movements which continue to the present. There is urgent need in America and Europe for a tectonic chronology of the Ice Age, based on transatlantic correlation of marine stages and simultaneous timing of the continental uplifts. So, Richard Luege, Ice Age History and Science, talks about Charles Worth. Though he favors the multiglacial hypothesis, gives an extensive discussion of the arguments advanced in the past for single glaciation, including a quite lengthy bibliography of writings of monoglacial geologists, especially in Europe. It's moving around back. Luege's suggestion, therefore, is not merely a current aberration. Luege is a professor of geomorphology in the Graduate School of Geography at Clark University and is also secretary of the Commission on Terrace Studies around the Atlantic for the International Geographical Union. He's currently writing a book on his proposed tectonic chronology of the glacial period. So if this concept is accepted, we're moving closer to the worldwide flood, and it certainly seems to be supported by much evidence, there must be a revolution in geological thought. One may anticipate, therefore, a great deal of resistance to it. Nevertheless, the evidence is there, and it obviously correlates with the concept of post-deluge effects, which we have been advocating all along. It appears in general that the concept of one great ice advance, which can be legitimately inferred from the deluge events, is supported by many independent lines of evidence, not only from the glacial deposits, but also from former lowered sea levels, former lower ocean temperatures. Emiliani, in Scientific American, and other evidences of cold climates at low latitudes, the evidence for more than one glaciation is utterly inadequate. There you go. Evidences for multiple glaciations are now being seriously reconsidered by even the orthodox geologists. They're getting tired of coming up with the same wrong answers. Further study is necessary to delineate the extent and character of deposits formed since the Ice Age, particularly in the non-glaciated regions. As a general rule, it seems likely that most of the deposits which have been populated and designated as tertiary deposits can be attributed to the waning action of the deluge and subsequent uplifts. Those commonly designated as Pleistocene usually can be attributed to the Ice Age or shortly before or after the Ice Age. And finally, those designated as recent can be accepted as having been formed after the Ice Age, and finally those designated as recent can actually be accepted as having been formed after the retreat of the Ice Age. So, evidence of continental ice sheets cannot be explained by uniformitarianism. We'll go into this next time.